Do you know that there is another directory service in the Azure, and that is known as Intra Domain Services? And that is basically a managed domain service. So, what does managed domain service mean? Managed domain service means that this directory service is managed by Azure, and you don't have much control over this directory service, but it will be serving the purpose. Now, what's the purpose of this directory service? So, let me give you some use cases. Like, let's go back to our on premises environment. So, that is having our legacy Active Directory, and some of the application servers are running in the on premises, and they do talk to the normal legacy Active Directory for authentication using their Kerberos or NTLM, or fetching the user's information via LDAP. So all these traditional protocols, right? Now you plan to move these application servers into the cloud, but you don't have any communication between the cloud and the Active Directory. So how these application server can do their all functions about the authentication and fetching the user's information, because they only know about these protocol. So let's consider this scenario where you are having Intra ID as a directory service in the cloud that you know. But Intra ID don't support those protocols, right? Intra ID doesn't support Kerberos. It does, but it's only supporting for particular use cases. But primarily, it support the modern authentication protocol like OIDC, SAML, OAuth, all those things. All right, so now you got your application servers running in the cloud, but you don't have any communication back to the on premises Active Directory. Maybe your firewalls are not allowing the legacy protocols between the cloud and the on premises due to some cyber risk. So, in that case, the intra domain service can be helpful because it supports all those protocols. It supports Kerberos, NTLM, LDAP, and all those things that the traditional Active Directory does. So, though it's Microsoft managed domain service, but it is kind of the same Active Directory service running in the cloud, which is managed by Azure. All right, so now if that sound interesting, so you might be thinking, how can I provision this domain service or directory service? So by default, the service is not enabled in the cloud. You need to enable it if you require. So in our scenario where we have on-premises Active Directory, we will be syncing our on-premises Active Directory with the Intra ID using the traditional tool like the Intra Connect. So it will be syncing all those users, group, password, their sets, and the user's attribute to the Microsoft Intra ID. Now, when you will provision this intra domain service in Azure, it will be syncing with the Microsoft Intra ID. So, whatever information in the Intra ID about users groups are having, or including the passwords as well, so that will get synced into this directory service. And remember, this is only one way sync. So, whatever you are writing over here, it won't be coming back into the Intra ID. So what happened when this intra domain service is provisioned? So before you provision intra domain service, you need a domain name for that service, and that domain name should not be the same as you are running in the on premises AD. So this domain name must be different domain name, and it has to be registered in the intra ID. So once you register that domain name into the Intra ID, you can provision this intra domain service, and it will pick that domain name as a namespace. So then Azure will provision two domain controllers as a replica set for that intra domain service. and these domain controllers are totally invisible to you. So those domain controllers are basically running in a virtual network that is Microsoft managed. So the benefit of having this managed domain in the cloud is that you do not need to manage, configure, and patch those domain controllers because those are managed by Azure. So you just need to take care of the communication between the application and the intra-domain service. So your application can then talk to the intra-domain services, and it's having all those information like the user's account, their SID, their passwords, groups, etc. from the on-premises AD because it is getting all those information from intra ID. So you won't feel much difference. You can use the same user accounts. You can even join these machines into the intra-domain service. So as I mentioned that the intra-domain service is a one-way sync from intra ID. You cannot sync back into the intra ID or back to the on-premises ID. And you can provision more replica set if you want in the another VNets. If you are having more VNets and you want that your applications running in those VNets want to have very short latency with that domain service, so you can provision more replica sets. And also you can provision the replica set in another region as well to provide it high availability in multi-region. LDAP write is possible in managed domain, but don't sync back to the intra ID. You can write into the domain services. Now you must be wondering, if you don't have access to the domain controllers, you cannot see the domain controllers. How can you access the Active Directory console or the group policy? So basically, you can configure those remote tools like the Active Directory remote tools or GPMC in any of the member server which is joined to this domain. So you can either use the application server, or maybe it's better to have a one admin jump server which is joined to this domain, and that jump server is having all those remote tool installed. So by using those remote tool, you can connect to that domain service or the domain controller and manage the Active Directory. You can configure the group policies, you can customize the OU structure as well, but you won't be having domain admin or intra admin permissions. Also, this managed domain support one-way forest trust from managed domain to on-premises. So it does support a one-way trust back to the on-premises. So in that case, if you have users in the on-premises who want to access the resources which are joined to the intra-domain service, so then you can use this one-way forest trust to allow those users to access these resources. All right, so in short, it allows the domain join. You can join your VMs into the intra-domain service. It allow you to configure the group policy. It support LDAP, Kerberos, and NTLM, all those old legacy protocols. Now let's see what are those scenarios where you might consider provisioning intra-domain service. All right, so one scenario could be where you don't want to extend your on-premises AD into the cloud. Extending on-premises AD into the cloud means running the additional domain controllers on VMs in the cloud, which are replicating to the on-premises domain controllers. So if you don't want to extend your on-premises Active Directory into the cloud, and also you don't want to open the communication on the legacy authentication protocols or legacy protocols, because Active Directory require hell lot of ports, right? Like the SMB or or RPC protocols, and a large dynamic port range. So if your cyber team is not agreeing to open those port on the colo firewall, that firewall which is separating your cloud and the on premises, so in that case you can consider running the intra-domain service domain because it's on the cloud, and your application that are only supporting those legacy protocols can use the intra-domain service in that case. And if you have a very limited use of Active Directory, yeah, so if you are a very small organization where you have very limited use of Active Directory, so you might not bother about running the additional Active Directory servers in the cloud, or maybe provisioning a new Active Directory environment in the cloud. If you are a startup, you are setting up your greenfield infrastructure, it doesn't make sense to install the Active Directory if you don't have much use of that Active Directory. Instead, you can just go for the managed domain service from the Microsoft. So these are some of the use cases where you can think of provisioning the intra-domain service. But if you ask me, in my experience, the large or medium-sized organizations, they rarely use intra-domain service, because most of the time the channel between the Azure and the on premises is opened, because there are so many applications and some business critical application as well which are still relying on the Active Directory, and using the intra-domain services won't be an easy fix, because there will be a lot of dependency on that Active Directory, and the Active Directory may be trusting to any other directory service. So there might be a lot of dependency and complex structure in most of the large organizations, and that's the reason they don't want to use the intra-domain services, because they still are okay with opening those ports to the on-premises Active Directory, or maybe extend that directory service into the Azure by running additional domain controllers in the cloud. But yes, for small organizations where Active Directory is having very limited use, yes, you can think of enabling the intra-domain services. All right, so now I hope that you got the some understanding of intra-domain service, and in which cases you should consider provisioning the intra-domain service, and what are the key features of this service.